All right, hello and welcome again. So today we're going to start with a little activity in logic, and not just the boring type of logic. We're going to do the guy on the left here. So this guy's name is Parmenides, and this is the guy that sold the idea of a priori, or the good, to both. Let me just get his name written down here. Sold sold the idea to both Socrates and Plato. So I mean, mainly through Socrates, because Socrates was just a young man when he met Parmenides, and was a big influential element of his thought, and that was later passed on to Plato. So we can kind of prove this. What Parmenides was saying. I mean, Parmenides actually had sort of a what he wrote a poem about this sort of religious experience he had, where he was taken through this experience, and he sort of had interesting things happen to him. I'll just say that. But he kind of looked at the experience, and knowing that it's true, he kind of go backwards. Oh, by the way, I don't know why this is only one here. But anyway, he went backwards and kind of proved what he was experiencing is possible, and not only possible, but in actuality, the only plausible thing to be true. So you're going to have to take my word for it for now, but know that that's what we're going to try to prove today. So we're going to start this way. So why something must have always have been. So Parmenides did kind of, like I say, we're going to be doing this as kind of a loose association with Parmenides' argument. But it doesn't have to be exactly to get the gist of what he was trying to get across. I try to make it as simple as possible here. So premise number one, there's going to be a few of these, a few different slides like this to prove a bunch of different things deductively, but just we'll get to it as due course comes. So premise number one, something is. So as far as I can tell, there's no person in history that would say that nothing is. I mean, obviously we're experiencing something. If we perceive the world as most of us do, we see material objects everywhere, and we have consciousness which perceives these material objects. I don't think there's anybody that's trying to make the argument that there isn't something. I mean, keep in mind this sort of term something is very general here. Just, it could be consciousness, it could be material. Don't think of it as like it has to be something material. Premise number two, nothing can come from nothing. So I would think, this is the one that people have harder time kind of wrapping their mind around, but I would think that this makes sense as well. I mean, we can't have nothing and then something come out of it. I mean, perhaps you could make the argument that, okay, well, I mean, there's nothing there generally, but we can say, okay, there's -3 and then there's +3, and then that equals nothing. So something kind of happened there, but what you're doing is overlaying consciousness on nothing to make it seem like something. So what there is consciousness, or there is some sort of thought process that goes into it. If you guys can give me a message on here finding some refutation of this premise, I'd love to hear it. I've listened to what's out there, and I haven't really got anything that seems to be a good argument against this. So we have just these two premises, but from there we can make a logical deduction. Therefore, something has always been. There was no period where there was nothing. Something was always there. And I mean, this doesn't seem that monumental on its own. I don't think anybody in materialism or anybody in spiritual beliefs would say that something has never been, or there was a time when there was nothing. But we're going to use this because now we've kind of created a new premise. Something has always been. Okay, so for the next one, why nothing cannot be. So we've already said nothing can come from nothing, but we're trying to prove now that why nothing cannot be. Premise one, something has always been. So we've established that we're perceiving a world, something is, right? And based on what we've deductively kind of looked at, obviously something has always been then. Premise number two, nothing can come from nothing. So we're reusing the other one. So something has always been, nothing can come from nothing, therefore nothing cannot be. So there is a kind of small little gap in the logic here, but we'll address that later. But I think we can kind of follow along the steps here too to say that nothing cannot be. So this kind of on its own doesn't seem like that big a deal, but if keep in mind, if movement is actually possible, something would have to move from where it was to where there is empty space. And we don't really have any proof of being empty space anywhere. I mean, you could say, okay, well, there's space out there, but this isn't really empty space. Einstein's space-time fabric would support this, that things react in a way that there's nothing there. I mean, there's nothing material there, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing there. And it seems like it responds as though there is something that we're not really taking in as material, but it still is something. So this is a big step, because with this one, this is what we're going to get into next here. For something to actually move, something would have to move to nothing, as we just said. But think of images that you see, like the example we gave before of the rock that drops, as distinct images on something that can show anything. So this screen did not have a rock move on it. It had a bunch of little tiny rock pictures that went all the way down here and then bounced up here and then went over and over and over and eventually stopped here. Now it looks like it's stopped, but really the image is just refreshing and looking as the same thing there. So premise number one for this last one, nothing cannot be. There is something that has always been and is unmovable, because nothing cannot be. Therefore, movement is impossible. So as I said before, there is a small little hole in this, which is the possible contingency that in order for something to move, this should be, put a little 2 because it don't look like I don't know how to write here. Something to move, something would have to be turned into nothing. So yeah, you could have something, like we've said, and then there's parts of it that maybe degrade into nothingness. But that doesn't really seem to be the case anywhere on Earth. We have the law of conservation, Lavoisier's law, if you want to take the Earth version of it. But generally, most of the scientific theories are based on the fact that there's entropy, which meaning things become more and more disordered, but nothing is created or destroyed. And this is the basic premise of all those that do physics and science and everything else. So, remember this picture. The all-seeing eye, the one in the center. So we've talked a little bit in roundabout terms about this triangle shape. And we've given the other example of the full circle and the triangle in this inside. And we say that these things never move. Or this thing never seems to change. It is the undifferentiating oneness that always is. And Parmenides called this the one. It would make sense that there is an element of this that is all-seeing, because nothing is happening outside of it. It is just, this is the reality of the sort of, if we want to take this analogy one step further, this would be like the screen that can present anything, but doesn't mean that there's nothing there on the screen. I mean, you can have a black screen, but that doesn't mean the screen is nothing. It's presenting nothing, but we can have images that are projected into it. So what is the answer to this? What are we trying to say about the nature of reality? As I say, this triangle shape is kind of always representing this notion of this all-seeing sort of idea. To a lot of people, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, and I can understand that, certainly. We can look at people, some of the geniuses of the past, though, to get an idea of how they conceived how something could be this all-seeing eye, and then there's these sort of images that are presented on this sort of canvas, which is the perceptual universe. That sentence is a little hard to stomach, I'm sure. But let's start with Rumi. So I think this guy's brilliant. I actually haven't investigated too much on what his actual thought is, but the bits that I get from him are really, really good. And I'm not even talking about the ones I'm going to reference right here. The guy's amazing. Islamic poet and seems to have as good a handle on everything as anybody else I know. So I should research him a little bit more and find out more about his work. But anyway, this is how he conceived of it. So open your eyes, for this world is only a dream. This place is a dream, only a sleeper considers it real. Then death comes like dawn, and you'll wake up laughing at what you thought was your grief. We have another one from a Chinese speaker here on the bottom. This guy, I think he was related with Confucius. I'm not sure about that though. Don't hold me to that. But anyway, this is one of his quotes, and he was the guy who had many of you maybe have heard of the butterfly dream that he talked about, and he couldn't figure out whether he was a butterfly having a human dream or a human having a butterfly dream. This is what he said: during our dreams, we do not know we're dreaming. We may even dream of interpreting a dream. Only after the great awakening will we realize that this is all the great dream. So they're basically saying there is this truth that always is, but there's also this dream state that we're in currently. Shakespeare, another one that I would say kind of took about this in a different way, but he conceived the world as a stage. And we have lots of examples, and I'd really like if you guys read Bottom's monologue, and especially A Midsummer's Night Dream. I think there's a lot of allusions to what we're talking about. I think a lot of people in history didn't want to say what I'm saying now, because the general milieu of the time wasn't open to these kind of ideas. And maybe that's an overgeneralization, but I'm saying it anyway. So I'm obviously not too scared about the consequences. But anyway, a lot of people kind of hid these things. And Bottom's monologue, I think, is a really good example. So if you want to look that up, the one he did once he woke up after the dream he had, or what he perceived as a dream in the forest, of these fantastic images of the fairy king and queen and his relationship with the fairy queen and everything else. And also A Dream Within a Dream by Edgar Allan Poe. Keep in mind, Edgar Allan Poe actually had an experience of writing a book that he claimed to be a true story that didn't happen yet. So if you guys know, so that story basically talked about Richard Parker, and Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story about Richard Parker who was cannibalized on a ship after the ship went down. And everybody was disgusted, obviously, and everybody was wondering why he would write such a thing, and he told everybody, insisted that it was a true story. And then everybody checked all the old ship logs and whether this really did happen, and they called him a liar. And then it turned out some years later that it actually did happen, and the guy that it happened to his name was Richard Parker. So just maybe an interesting story. Maybe we don't want to give it any more meaning than that, but to me that's quite interesting. So Shakespeare called it a stage, though. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women mere players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. So he's saying that all your life is like a stage. And I mean, there's an argument for sure that you could say that he's just referring to what he knows best, which is making plays. But I think if you look at a little deeper into, especially A Midsummer's Night Dream, you'll see a lot of these themes of kind of people being representing what they have perceptually as reality, and dreams being this sort of very thin veil. But I'm going to make that assertion, but I don't think everybody believes that for sure. Democritus said almost the exact same thing. So Democritus was actually the person we get theory of atoms from. So actually Democritus had this concept of these little tiny atoms and there being void around them. So he's actually contradicting what we're saying, but this is his quote: the world is a stage, life's an entrance, you came, you saw, you went. So the same kind of way, he adds to it, a person must know that he is separated from reality. So I would suggest that they're kind of making the same point that we're talking about, especially with the Rumi quote and the one from ancient China. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. And these are sayings in common folk songs, and then we also have You're Living in a Dream World, Neil, of The Matrix. It brings up some interesting stuff. So we've always kind of looked at all of people in history as liars, that what they say that they saw probably wasn't true. We hear people talking about dragons in every culture and all these fantastic images. But what if it is a dream? That would make a lot of sense, right? Think about when you're a kid and you have these dreams of these unbelievable circumstances that come up. There's a creature that's the size of a building and it's chasing you and it's looks like your teddy bear and everything else. All these the rules of the world really haven't confined your individual thinking yet. So perhaps we have this kind of collective experience with that sort of all-seeing mind, which is experiencing the world in its own way and convincing itself of what is true and what is not true. But maybe this is all sort of this dream concept. And this is, keep in mind, I'm kind of, like I say, going about this sort of knowing where I'm going. So uh, if you don't feel convinced yet, there's more evidence coming. But but this makes a lot of sense if you want to believe any stories of history, right? Because they're situations or things that are just not feasible in our world. We'll reconceptualize what this guy was saying before. So number one, that he lost his son, and then it re-represented itself as his daughter. That doesn't seem so wild or crazy now, because I mean, if you have this in your mind as something that should be in your life, it's not overwhelmingly difficult to understand how you'd recreate it in the world that you're perceiving, in the dream that you're perceiving. You have to fill that hole that was left. And our other quote, man did not create religion, religion created men. All of a sudden, at least I know how hard it was to think about before, but at least you have a window into how they could think that. So there's these overall concepts of us trying to recreate things in the world that are our true nature, but we're doing it in a dream state and in a fearful dream state. So the fear is something that we'll have to talk about later, but I think that's going to come up a little bit later or a little bit further on, because I'm going to try to pace myself here. I'm not going to try to talk about things that are too wild quite yet. And I know you're probably thinking this is already pretty wild, but trust me, it goes deeper. Let's look at an example of Mother Teresa. So Mother Teresa is known for her charity. And a really interesting story I always kind of was drawn to was she was offered to join an anti-war rally, and she refused and said she would join a pro-peace one. So to somebody that's a materialist, that makes zero sense, right? They're the same thing. To somebody that doesn't think that our consciousness is influencing the world. Uh, but to her, I mean, you could just make the argument, okay, well, she's trying to be positive. But I think this is something that she really did believe. And we want material sort of zero sum loss. So you're doing something. In order to stop it, you have to do something that is going to force stop it. But really, maybe we're doing ourselves a disservice by trying to stop things. Uh, you give, therefore you lose. You may gain something, but you're merely trading. So the world, as we perceive it, if we're materially perceiving it, there's no way to really gain anything. The only thing we can gain in the world is when you teach somebody something, and then it is strengthened in your mind, in their mind, and you wouldn't say you'd lose anything in that situation, right? You gave the knowledge to somebody else, and that strengthened both of you. So with this same logic, you create what you fear. So if there's something in the world that you fear, then you're reinforcing it, you're strengthening it in the world. You're making it more and more likely to happen, because mind is the controlling force here if we believe this system of belief. I think I've laid this out pretty slowly, and I don't think this is going to seem outrageous to anybody yet, but this is what we'll leave off today. And maybe just give a little bit of notion, or a little bit of credence to this notion of you may create what you fear. And this is an axiom that people have talked about all throughout time. And people kind of just dismiss it as just a nice notion, maybe. But maybe there's more truth to this than we've always let on. Anyway, that's as much as we'll talk about today. And I don't know why that little speak there, or what I just said there, sounded so high. But anyway, I'll leave it there. We'll talk about more of these kind of ideas maybe a little bit later. Have a good day. Bye.